Richmond, Texas or Sugar Land, Texas, which one is the best for you? In this video, we're gonna do a deep dive and go into the good, the bad, the ugly of both. And hopefully at the end of this video, you find which one is the best for you. Hi, my name is Aaron, and every week I'm helping buyers relocate to and throughout the greater city of Houston and the surrounding suburbs. So if you need to know anything about where to eat, sleep, live, play, hit me up morning, noon, or night. I'm your guy. I'll drop my number on the screen. Send me a carrier pigeon, send me an email, whatever you got to do to get in touch with me. It doesn't matter if you're a day, a week, a month, a year, 2 years, 3 years out. I would love to be a resource to you. So today it's a battle for the top Southwest Houston suburb, and I get calls for both of these, probably the most, between Sugar Land and Richmond. Both are super great locations, and I have clients that have moved into both. But today we're gonna cover everything, and by the end of this video, you're gonna know exactly which one is the best one for you. I get calls and texts every week for both of these suburbs, both Sugar Land and Richmond. They're two of the most popular suburbs with my clients for those that are looking to be in that southwest portion of the greater Houston metro. So I think it was only right that we do a comparison between the two. They're basically next door neighbors. In this video, I'm going to answer all the questions that I've ever been asked for these locations and hopefully help you narrow down which one is the best fit for you. To get things started, let's show the distance between downtown city of Houston and each one of those suburbs. Like many of our suburbs, Richmond is about 30 miles away. Most of our suburbs in the greater Houston metro start somewhere around 30 to 35 miles away. And depending on kind of which part of Richmond you're in, you're going to be somewhere around that same distance. My aunt stayed not too far from here, but when I was doing that trek, when I first moved into the greater Houston metro, we were about 35 miles from the downtown center of the city. And so this, for a distance standpoint, is going to be fairly far. As you can see right now, this is early morning traffic, and we are already seeing about an hour of traffic, right? And so in my experiences, this was one of the worst drives that I had ever done. Each time I tried to use 69 to get into the city, it was a nightmare. Each time I did 99 to 10, it was just 20 extra miles longer to get from where we lived at that point in time to the downtown part of Houston. What I ended up doing the most was using the 90 alternate road. That was the most consistent, and in and out of work for me, that would end up being about an hour and 5 pretty much each way. On days where there was like a wreck or traffic or something out there, that could end up being easily an hour and a half. So definitely coming from this part of Richmond going into the center of the city is definitely not going to be your best bet. You can expect about an hour each way, no matter what. From a distance perspective, Sugar Land is about 10 miles closer. And so I've never lived in Sugar Land, but I did work in Sugar Land, and so I can attest that this is pretty accurate for what you're going to get if you're coming from the center of the city and going to and from Sugar Land. There were a couple times on 59 where there was a wreck, and that would turn my commute from a normal like 45 to 50 minutes into somewhere around an hour and 15. But for the most part, you're going to be somewhere in that 40 to 45 minute zone to get from Sugar Land to the downtown Houston or the greater just inner loop. And so from a distance standpoint, I would definitely give the nod to Sugar Land, and that's just because it's about 10 miles closer if you just look from a map standpoint. And so you get to cut out some of this trek right here from Richmond to get onto 69, or some of these back roads to get onto 69 if you're going to be traveling from Richmond versus Sugar Land. So I would give the slight nod to Sugar Land, but I wouldn't say it's a make or break thing. They're closer than they probably present themselves, just with my experiences. When clients are reaching out and they're asking me about both of these locations, I ask them this question: how often are you going to be traveling in and out of the city? And if they say they're going to be flying often, then I say, okay, we may want to reconsider this, just because the distance to either one of those airports is not the best. If you are going to be forced to fly out of the international bush up north, that's one of the worst for either one of these locations. And Hobby's a little bit better for both of them, but not much better, right? So let's hop in the maps right now just so I can show you a little bit more about what I mean. So just on distance alone, Richmond is about 60 miles from the airport if you are going to be traveling out of IAH. And it's every bit of that. I know when I first moved here and I stayed temporarily with my aunt, as we were kind of winding down on that time in my life, I had to go and get my wife from the airport. And so it was like a 6 a.m. drive time just to get there, to pick my wife up around 7:30, and it took every bit of an hour and like 10 minutes to get there from Richmond to the airport. And I was just like, there's no way that trip alone to go and pick up my wife from the airport was enough for me to say I will never go and live in Richmond. It was literally like an hour and 10 minutes. Just as it's saying right now, we did this trip right here. We basically got onto the Beltway and rode the Beltway all the way up and around until we could get off at the exit that takes you to the airport. And it was every bit of that hour. And so if IAH is definitely going to be the airport that you are going to use probably the most often, I don't know if I would actually recommend either one of these because they're going to be very far. Hobby gets a little bit more reasonable, but you're still about 40 miles away. Having no traffic is still going to take you somewhere between 40 and 45 minutes just to get from Richmond or most parts of Richmond to the Hobby airport. So that's something to keep in mind if you are going to be traveling in and out of the city. You can be saving yourself about 20 minutes if you change your airport to Hobby over IAH up north, but that's still not the closest trek. And there's definitely locations that are closer to both of those airports. Similar story, Sugar Land is only a few miles shorter of a distance, so you're probably going to gain somewhere between 10 and 15 minutes if you were to live in Sugar Land and want to travel to or use IAH as your primary airport, but you're not going to gain the most in time. So again, I would give a slight edge to Sugar Land if you are going to be traveling to IAH. Same kind of story here. If you were to use Hobby as your main airport, you're going to basically save 10 miles or so just to get to the airport. So on average, it'll take you like 30 to 35 minutes to get to the Hobby airport from most places in the Sugar Land area. So if you had to pick one, I would give the slight edge, like I said, to Sugar Land, just because you're about 10 miles closer to the center of the city and to both of these airports. The next thing we're going to talk about is the overall attractions and infrastructure and things that you can do in each one of these locations. I think that both of them are great. They both, the beautiful thing about living in any of the Houston suburbs is that you are going to have the amenities that you need. You're going to have all your grocery stores. You're going to have some little shopping boutique. You're going to have your restaurants. You're going to have your parks, your walking trails, depending on the community that you choose and the amenities that already come within that community. But you're going to have everything you need. There's nice little bowling alleys, nice little wineries. There's always something that you can do in either one of these locations. On average, I would say that Richmond presents a little bit more small town than Sugar Land does. Richmond, there's a lot of turns in Richmond that you can make, and you can be in some very rural, kind of farmlandy, sort of less de-restricted areas. And so that's a little bit of a different look than Sugar Land gives you, which Sugar Land just presents more as a closer to a metropolitan area. It's more similar to a Houston than Richmond does, in my opinion. But when I lived out in Richmond with my aunt for that about month or so before I actually moved into the actual city of Houston, I can say that I enjoyed my stay out in Richmond. There was always something to do. They had nice restaurants, they had parks and lakes and things that you can go to and kind of walk around. Her specific community had an amenity center that had its own pool and stuff like that. So I know a lot of the communities that are being built, and her house is probably about 20 or 30 years old at this point. And so the newer communities damn near always have like an amenity center that has a pool and the splash pads and the slides and stuff for kids. And so there's always going to be something to do. There's a great bowling alley off of 99 that we went to out there. There's just a lot that you can do in the greater Richmond area. Similarly, in the Sugar Land area, there's also going to be a ton to do, with the slight edge that Sugar Land has its own town center that has its own specific shopping and eateries and places where you can go and grab a drink and stuff for the kiddos. There's always just some fun stuff that is going around in the greater Sugar Land town center. I also would give a nod to those baseball enthusiasts because they have their own minor league team, the Space Cowboys. I've never gone to a game, but all of my friends and my clients that have moved to the Sugar Land area that have gone to games say it's a really nice experience, and you don't feel like you need to go all the way into the city to see the Astros because you got your own team in your own backyard that you can check out. So as far as parks, movie theaters, restaurants, grocery stores, you're going to have all the amenities. That's the beauty about being so close to Houston. is that all of those communities on the outskirts are being built out at rapid speed. And so even if you are in the section that doesn't have it quite yet, you are definitely going to get all the amenities that you'll ever need just being a part of the greater Houston metro. But as you get, I would say, further and further out in Richmond, some of those parts that are just farmlands that are being redeveloped and being taken over, you may not have the infrastructure that you have there. You know, Sugar Land is a little bit more landlocked, and so there's already stuff and amenities kind of surrounding it as well that you get to piggyback off and play off of. But I would definitely say they're about what and what. But if you're a baseball enthusiast or you want some more defined shopping, I would give the slightest of edge to Sugar Land. But if that's not your thing, then you're about what and what for both. So the next thing that I want to talk about is the price of entry for Richmond and for Sugar Land. What you tend to see is that Richmond, because it is such a larger area, you get more options as far as home availability, inventory, as well as a more affordable price point. And Sugar Land tends to be a little bit smaller on the inventory side and tends to be a little bit more in demand. And so the overall pricing tends to reflect that, showing that Sugar Land is going to be a little bit more expensive. Right now, as a recording of this video, the average single family home sales price around the greater Houston metro is somewhere around $425,000. So we're going to use that as our benchmark to see how many options that you can get, both new and old, at around $425,000 or less in Richmond or in Sugar Land. So as of the recording of this video, the greater Richmond area has a lot of growth that you can get new construction. I know some of my favorite ones, and I've done some reviews on this channel for the Richmond locations that are right off of the tollway here. There's like 2 or 3 communities right there that are really nice. One's a D.R. Horton community and the other is a Taylor Morrison. And I can't remember who that third builder is, but there's a few different developments right there at different price points. But as of the recording of this video, you have several communities that you can afford if you are approved for that $450,000 to $475,000 range. You have a ton that you can get new construction wise, going far west, closer to Fulshire, or if you want to be a little bit more closer to the Beltway. So depending on which side of the world you prefer to be on, whether you're outside of 99 or inside of it, you'll definitely have some options at $450,000 or so in this current market. When it comes to resale homes, the flow for Richmond tends to also be a little bit better, and so you're going to see a bunch of options. There's options coming on and off the market all the time in the Richmond area. Usually when somebody reaches out to me and say kind of what can I get in the greater Richmond area right now, it's a ton, and this is a bunch under $450,000 right now. So you definitely are going to have some more solid options in the Richmond area just because of the barrier of entry is a little bit lower. But right now, as you can see, you have a ton all the way up close to Katy and all the way down past Rosenberg. You got options depending on where you're trying to be. So from a perspective of new construction in Sugar Land right now, you have no options under $425,000. To what you're going to see more and more common right now if you're looking in Sugar Land for new construction is that you are going to be in an uber kind of luxury price point, somewhere around that $700,000, $800,000, $900,000. And so as you can see, once we kind of remove this constraint, you'll get some more options, but they're going to be fairly pricey options in some of the better locations. You got, this is the cheapest one I'm seeing right now at $519. But for the most part, you are going to be in some locations that are kind of closer to these lake communities out here. And you see that's almost $2 million. We got an 800, we got a 900. So it's definitely going to be a tad bit pricier on the new construction side as you go and look in Sugar Land. But that's mainly because Sugar Land is pretty much landlocked. I mean, you're landlocked basically between Sienna, which is a Missouri City community out here, and Rosenberg and Richmond. You're basically landlocked between all of those places, and so there's only so much land and there's only so much development in Sugar Land. Sugar Land is basically built out at this point. When it comes to resale homes, you're still going to have a lot to offer out here in the greater Sugar Land area under that $450,000 mark, but it is going to be way less inventory. And so what you're going to see is a lot of the values of some of the older homes in the area, but just because there isn't as much opportunity, those values are going to hold a little bit higher. And so You may find yourself feeling like you may be paying a little bit more for something that's a little bit older in the greater Sugar Land area. But overall, there's still a ton of affordability. I've been doing a lot of touring out there, and I've had some clients that are actively looking out in that area, and we're looking at that $375,000 price point, and we've still been able to check out a ton. So for housing, both new construction and resale, I would give a slight edge to Richmond on this one. You're just going to have more affordable prices. Now, don't get me wrong, you definitely have some mini McMansions out in Richmond that can run you up a nice little tab. But as far as availability and at the current price point and what the market is showing, you're going to have way more availability in the overall Richmond area versus Sugar Land. The next elephant in the room that I get asked, probably the #1 question that comes out of someone's mouth after they say, hey, I want to move to Richmond, or hey, I want to move to Sugar Land, is how is it with flooding? And like I tell any of my clients, if it can rain, it can flood. And if we base everything off of Harvey, anywhere that was in the greater Houston metro that had any amount of rain, they had some level of impact. Now, it may not have been flooding into your home or, you know, flooding up into your yard, but it could have manifested itself in street flooding. Your route to your job or away from your home was altered during Harvey, and no one really had any exceptions around the greater Houston metro. Richmond and Sugar Land did better, I would say, than probably most. But in either one of these locations, you are going to have a higher flood risk because you are close to the Brazos. And so you are definitely not out of the woods, but that is not too dissimilar from all of our suburbs. All of our suburbs around the greater Houston metro have some kind of a water threat, whether that's a lake or that's some kind of a river pulling off of that lake or some kind of bayou or reservoir. You really can't avoid it in the greater Houston metro when it comes to the suburbs. And Richmond and Sugar Land are no different. But on our side, some of the things that came out of this was that there are some tools that we can use to make sure that you, as the potential buyer, make sure that you're not buying a flood limit or buying in a zone that you are not comfortable with living. And so let's hop into HAR right now and check out some of those tools that we got as a result of Harvey. And so one of the best things, if you can say this is a great thing, one of the best things that we got out of Harvey was the infrastructure that we needed to help our future buyers figure out and determine what's a good area, what's a safe area when it came to flooding and other issues around the greater Houston metro. We've got some great map features that were added to us after Harvey to kind of help us navigate, because we all got those same questions. Did it flood here? Did it flood there? Am I at flood risk? Am I going to need flood insurance? And some of those questions were things that we just couldn't answer as real estate agents before, not very easily. We had to go and search a bunch of places. It was hard to point someone in the right direction very quickly, and one of the results of that was these flood maps. So I'm going to hop in. This is in a Sugar Land location. We're going to use a resale home, and we're going to hop in to the flood maps. And as you can see, for this specific location, you are in a little bit of a flood zone, the 500-year floodplain. But as you back out, you can see that Sugar Land, just with its current location, is mostly in the 500-year floodplain, right? There's going to be some areas that are in the red, but for the most part, you're going to have some level of risk because you are basically hugging right up against this Brazos. And so depending on which part of Sugar Land you're in, I know I've had some clients that kind of move up to the more northern side that's a little bit further away and have some spots up here near First Colony where you aren't as in a flood risk as other places. But kind of as you get more and more south in the Sugar Land, going more and more towards Richmond, you are definitely at a higher risk of flood. And so you may or may not be required, based on when this community was built or when this community was originally mapped, you may or may not be required to have flood insurance at the time of this recording. And that can all change just based on how the overall climate and things change in the region. Similarly, like I said, in the greater Richmond area, if we're looking over here, that Brazos is kind of running south of Sugar Land and running right through Richmond. And so as we kind of look at some of these locations and some of these communities, there's communities that are out here going south that would be considered Richmond, that would not be the biggest deal when it comes to flooding. But as you kind of tinker around in some of these locations where a lot of these new build communities are, you are definitely going to be in a situation where you are at a higher flood risk than others. Some of these communities, like off of the West Park Tollway, which are some of my favorite communities because it gets all of that guesswork of, am I in a floodplain, out of the way. Like I said, there's some Taylor Morrisons, there's some D.R. Horton communities up in this area at the northern end of Richmond. So in basically both locations, the more north you go, the better off you're going to be. The more south you go, you are going to be in the overall closeness or that proximity of the Brazos, and you're probably going to have some level of elevation for flooding. And so I don't know if I would give the nod to either one here. If I had to pick one, I would say Richmond by the slightest bit, because they have more land mass of places that are considered Richmond that are out of the floodplain, just as a location for location map sense. They have more locations that are outside of a floodplain. So I would give the slightest edge to Richmond. During Harvey, both of these locations did okay. Like I said, my aunt lives out here. She rode Harvey out in her house. We couldn't really get to her. She had wind damage, but she did not have any water damage. In her community, she's walking distance away from a lake, and so she did not have issues. Many places, it's going to be hit or miss. One of the things that we have to check on an individual basis is the seller's disclosure. In addition to the map, just to kind of paint that overall picture, that seller's disclosure shows, you know, what that particular house had and the issues that that particular house had. But from a flooding issue of just the maps, slight edge to Richmond. And to show you briefly what a seller disclosure looks like, let's hop on in right now. And basically it goes down and it tells you what issues you should expect and what they've experienced as the owner, what things they know that are broken. The things that we would care about in this section when it comes to flooding is basically section 5. Are you in a floodplain? Have you ever flooded? Do you know of any water breaches or any reservoir releases or anything near you? They said no, and they've owned this house since 2015, so that's probably a good indication. But the most important one is, have you ever filed a claim for flood issues? If they say no here and it all says basically no here, there's a good likelihood that you did not flood during Harvey, and you would probably not flood with something that is as bad as Harvey in the area. So those are the two things that we would be checking out the most. We would be checking out the seller disclosure, and we would be checking out the maps. But in this instance, if I had to give a vote, like I said, slightest of vote to Richmond, because they just have more land mass that is in an X zone versus Sugar Land. So how are the schools? That's the next thing on the list. I get that question asked probably as much as I get for the flooding question. And depending on which place you live, in Richmond, you can have either Lamar Consolidated ISD, which is a super solid school district out in the greater West Texas area, or you can be where most of it is, and most of the Richmond area lies in the greater Fort Bend ISD. When you come down to Sugar Land, majority of that location is Fort Bend ISD. And so right now, let's hop on over into Niche and check out both of these school districts and see how they stack up. So we're gonna get started with Fort Bend ISD. This is the one that they both share. As you can see, it is overall A-rated, great for diversity, solid teachers and academics. It's rated as the #4 most diverse school district in Texas. And so this is definitely, when anyone says they want some diversity and they're looking out north, I'm telling them you gotta get in Fort Bend, because it is definitely one of the most diverse in Texas. It's top 56 for best school districts overall in Texas, so that's pretty solid when you have about 1,000. And then it is top 64 for student athletes. So if you have a kiddo that's going to be pursuing sports at a high level, it's top 64 for those as well. Looking on over at the map, as you can see, this kind of hovers around Richmond and goes down into Sugar Land. So depending on which side of the location you are in, as you kind of get to the more south end of Sugar Land and the more south end of Richmond, you see most of these on average are A's. As you kind of go more towards those Harris County sort of parts of the location, the school ratings drop just a tad. Not bad schools, but as you can see, the overall rating is just a little bit better the more south you are in Richmond and Sugar Land. Hopping on over into the other school district that represents Richmond, we are talking about Lamar Consolidated ISD. Again, A for diversity, solid school, solid academic. Hopping on down, not as diverse, but it's still top 50, right? It's number 33 of most diverse districts. Not as great for athletes, still top 100. And overall, one of the best school districts, being top 81 out of 1,000. So still not a bad location, but it is just not as diverse as Fort Bend County, which just has a lot of schools within it. But as you kind of go over here and you notice the map for those that are tied to Lamar Consolidated ISD, you're not seeing any C's in here, where in the Fort Bend side, you had a bunch of C's at the north side. So on average, the people that are tied to the Lamar Consolidated ISD swear by it. They say their kids thrive in it and they love it. My clients that have Lamar Consolidated ISD children, they love those schools. And the ratings kind of reflect that, right? So I would definitely say in either one of these locations, depending on which side of the fence you're on, your kid is going to win. You really can't go wrong with any one of these school districts. And even if you are tied to a school that is rated not as great, you can kind of shuffle around within your district and find a B rated or an A rated school fairly close to you. So on this one, I would vote that it's a tie. Everybody wins. You know, there's definitely going to be A and B rated options very close to you. If we need to move around, or if we need to target a specific area or neighborhood tied to the school that you want your kiddo to be in, we can do that. But you're definitely going to have great options in Lamar or Fort Bend, depending on whether you're living in Richmond on the far west side, or if you're living in Richmond in the middle, or if you're living in Sugar Land. And the last thing we need to talk about are the taxes. For the most part, I would say that Richmond and Sugar Land are more affordable when it comes to the taxes compared to some of the more expensive places like your Katie's or your Cypress or even your Woodlands. There are definitely some pockets that do have a higher tax rate, but for the most part, you're going to see somewhere around that mid-2 in both of those locations. The tax trends do, however, follow basically the same trends. If it's a community that was built 2015 and newer, more times than not, you're going to be in a tax rate that is in those high 2s to low 3s. And if you have an established location that is a little bit older and a little bit more mature, you typically are in the low 2s to 1%. But when compared to some of these suburbs that are close to them or not that far on the opposite side of the greater Houston metro, those definitely have much higher tax rates on average than both Richmond and Sugar Land. And so which one do you pick, Richmond or Sugar Land? I love both. I think that if distance and your commute to the airport and to the inner city a little bit more times than not is something that you do, then I would say that Sugar Land has a slight edge. They both have great affordability, but Richmond offers a little bit more in the resale side as well as in new construction options under the $450,000 price point. And so you definitely get more options there. There's a little bit more to do in the Sugar Land area, depending on kind of what your style is, whether or not you're into sports or whether or not you want some a little bit more defined shopping. But the beautiful thing about both of these is that you're so close that you could live in one and use the amenities of the other. So that's always a plus. The schools are going to be solid on both sides. We saw a lot of A's and A pluses across the board. So the kiddos are going to win. Both are going to have a higher elevated flood risk, and the tax rates on both of them are a little bit more affordable on the Richmond and the Sugar Land side compared to the greater suburb metro, but they still are going to follow the same trends, where in new construction you're going to pay a little bit more of a premium, and in older homes you're going to have a little bit of a lower tax rate. So which one is the best for you? Is it Richmond or is it Sugar Land, Texas? Both are great options, and I don't think you can really miss on either one of them. If you're not quite sold on Richmond or Sugar Land, Texas, I've done a ton of vlogs on other surrounding communities. You can check those out right there. YouTube thinks that you should actually check this one out next. So after this video, go on ahead and click that one. I look forward to hearing from you, and I hope you have an amazing day.